Hey crew, before we get started today, I wanted to let you know what's coming up in the near future for the show. We'll be taping a live episode of the podcast at Convergence Con in Minneapolis this Friday. This is our third year at Convergence, and it's a really great con. I love going there. I'll be out and about at the show doing some paneling and talking about films and comic books and, of course, Star Trek. So if you see me there, make sure you say hi. The subject of our live show this year is Star Trek 2009. Oh yeah, we're pulling on all the stops on this one. We're going to have some prizes and some merch we'll be giving away at the panel. So if you're going to be at the con, don't miss it. It's at 5 p.m. Central Time this Friday, July 5th in room Greenway FG. If you're at the show, you'll know what that means, hopefully. If you're not going to be at that show, no big deal. You can still watch the panel live on our Facebook page at facebook.com/EISTpod. And you can comment on the video while it's live. Why am I telling you? You know how this works. We'll be taking questions from the audience during the panel, and I will try to integrate any Facebook questions we get. You can also tweet us during the show or tweet at us at EISTpod. Speak up if you like the Kelvin Universe films, if you don't like the Kelvin Universe films. Doesn't matter. Weigh in. Give us what you got. All right. Today I'm talking to David Mack, author of 1,000,002 Star Trek novels, to be precise. This counts as a standard episode related show, but since he wrote the episode that we're talking about today, we're going to do it a little differently. And Dave and I talk about the process of the show going from idea to script to screen. And he has been a great guest in the past. He's still a great guest, so I hope you enjoy our talk. Just a note, this episode was recorded soon after the finale of Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, so there might be slight spoilers for the end of Disco Season 2 if you haven't seen it yet, so spoiler zone alert. Incidentally, Dave will be at the Shore Leave Convention in the Baltimore area the weekend after next, as will many Star Trek authors, writers, and personalities, many of whom have graced the ones and zeros of this podcast. And we, that is enterprising individuals, will be there too. I'm excited to get a chance to finally go to Shore Leave. I've heard a lot about it, and it sounds like a great convention. This is their 41st year, so they're doing something right. I will be talking with some of those authors and guests when I'm at the show, and I'll probably do a mini episode or something like that when I'm at the con. And there will definitely be a supplemental episode all about Shore Leave once I get back, so stay tuned for that. Okay, that is it. Enjoy my talk with David Mack. Tune in at 5 p.m. this Friday on Facebook. And with that, let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I wanna know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I wanna know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and I'm going to need you to pay attention because there is a test later. I'm joined once again on this episode by New York Times bestselling author David Mack, who has written over 30 Star Trek novels, short stories, and novellas, as well as the Deep Space Nine episodes Starship Down and It's Only a Paper Moon. Dave also writes non-Trek fiction. His latest novel, The Iron Codex, is the second entry in the Dark Arts series and is available now. David, welcome back to the show.
Hey, great to be here.
It's great to have you back again. Today we'll be talking about Starship Down, the 7th episode of the 4th season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and we'll be doing things a bit differently today. It's not often that I get a chance to talk about an episode of Star Trek with the person who actually wrote it, and since I've got one half of the team behind the creation of Starship Down, we'll be talking about the experience of writing for Trek, developing an idea for the screen, getting to play with Trek characters and Trek actors, and more. We'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, David, at the time of this recording, Star Trek Discovery has just finished its second season. A Picard show is currently in production. A Section 31 show is in the process of development, along with several animated series. 21st Century Trek is in full bloom, but are we at the particular fullness of time for Trek to come back in strength? Why now? Do you see the franchise continuing to expand?
I have absolutely no idea. Nobody tells me anything.
Exactly. Okay, great. Are you happy with the expansion of Trek right now?
I mean, it is what it is. I was interesting because I got to work a little bit behind the scenes on season 1 of Discovery.
Yeah.
mostly because I was writing the first tie-in novel based on the series.
Right.
And so it was decided that I needed to have access to certain information. And as a result, I was seeing all the scripts, and I was able to provide notes on those scripts via Kirsten Beyer, who at the time was the staff writer on Discovery. And so I felt like I got to have a little bit of input. And then, of course, with the second season, because I was not working on anything directly Discovery related on the tie-in side, it was decided that there was no need for me to remain on the distribution list, so they took me off. So I didn't really know much about what was coming in season 2, aside from what Kirsten told me behind the scenes. So I didn't really get to have any input on season 2, but it's interesting in that the season in which I had no direct input seems to have inadvertently picked up a number of ideas from my work and reimagined them for Discovery.
Yeah, specifically, I mean, you've got a Section 31 novel called Control, which features an AI taking over Section 31, and that pretty much is a very major subplot in the second season of Discovery.
And I'm told that that was coincidental, that the name Control, which in terms of its relationship to intelligence services has some basis in real-world intelligence community organization,
sure,
and which was featured in John le Carré novels such as Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. That was most likely the same source of inspiration for the Discovery writers as it was for me,
sure,
and as it was for the creators of the sort of classic comedy TV series Get Smart, who parodied that notion by calling their organization Control.
Right.
A lot of people don't know that, like, when they hear Control, they think Get Smart. In fact, Get Smart got it from John le Carré, who got it from the actual intelligence community.
Sure.
So it's interesting that we arrived at similar conclusions, although our outcomes are very different.
Yeah.
With regard to Control.
Having written the first Discovery tie-in novel, Desperate Hours, some of the character details and bios that you created for the book shows up on screen. Is that interactivity going to be a feature of the new world of CBS All Access Trek and the Discovery novels? Or is the flow of influence from books to screen or screen to books is generally just one way?
Well, in the past, it used to be one way. I think it's becoming a little more reciprocal. And although many of the canonical details that were established in season 2, particularly with regard to Burnham, her relationship with Spock, her youth, how she grew up, etc., many of the details established in season 2 override what I was told when I was writing book 1.
Okay.
And so many of the details I put into book 1 have been knocked out of continuity by canon revelations in season 2.
Sure.
However, at the same time, they tried to seed some of those details they knew they were working on into subsequent Discovery novels, such as Fear Itself by James Swallow or
Right.
The Weight of the Stars by Una McCormick. And in fact, it's my understanding that the back and forth between Una and Kirsten behind the scenes helped inform some of the details that made their way into season 2 regarding Tilly.
Okay.
So I think that process is continuing, but it should always be taken with a grain of salt. The show will always take precedence over the tie-ins. The tie-ins are the tip of the tail. They don't wag the tail or even the dog.
Yeah, right. The fact that they're coming out so concurrently, though, I think it's cool if they're trying to set it up as them being kind of beta plus canon and being in a position where they can give curious readers a specific place to go to get more depth on those characters.
What's interesting, though, is that the Discovery novels to date have all been prequels because the continuity on the series itself is so tight, and it really leaves no blank spaces into which one can comfortably drop a new narrative using the characters as they exist in the show.
Right.
So those of us who write the Discovery tie-in novels are forced to think in terms of biographical stories that delve into the character's past. That's really the only place we could go without stepping, on their toes.
Mm-hmm. You've got a sequel to Control coming out later this year entitled Collateral Damage, which will focus on Captain Picard. Now, I know that talking to you about your work in progress is like reading the Mueller report. Lots of things are redacted here, but can we expect any parallels between what you're writing for Picard and what we may see on the new Picard series?
No.
Okay.
It's my understanding that when the new Picard series hits in December, it will probably blow the entire shared literary continuity of the Star Trek novels that we've been working on for the last 16 years out of the water. It will be a full broadside of torpedoes, and the ship will go down in flames.
Sure. Now, another universe has already experienced something like this, Star Wars, and their response to this was to create the on-screen sort of canon version and then the Legends version, which is all the collected books and comics and stories that have come before can be appreciated, as they should, as side stories or different stories, but not really being connected necessarily to the future of the filmic franchise. Is that what we're looking at with Star Trek TV?
Well, it's less extreme in that the problem that Star Wars had, especially back in the late 90s through the early 2000s, and up until the point where the new movies started to come out, was that they had been telling people the books were canon. Or at the very least, they were soft canon or a level of canon. They had levels of canon. And as a result, the readers of the books and the comics had come to have this expectation that the stories they were being told were going to be respected in terms of the on-screen continuity, should that ever happen again.
Yeah.
And then the moment they went back to making films and TV series like Clone Wars and Rebels, well, that all went out the window, and those fans found out the hard way that tie-ins do not drive the parent franchise.
Right.
And because Star Wars had created that expectation that there was a level of canonicity in those works, when they had to walk it back, the fans were quite annoyed with them.
Yeah.
By contrast, Star Trek has never made that promise. Star Trek has always been very explicit, even though some fans just never seem to get it through their head, the difference between canon and continuity.
Sure.
They have always been told from the very beginning, no Star Trek tie-in material is canon. Not the games, not the comics, not the novels. It doesn't matter who wrote it. It doesn't matter that Jerry Taylor wrote Mosaic. It doesn't matter that Shatner wrote a bunch of novels with Gar and Judy Reeves-Stevens.
Right.
None of that matters. The books, the games, the comics, not canon. Never have been. Now, canon simply means, in the context of Star Trek, or usually in the context of, say, a religious body of work,
right.
the core body of work which constitutes the accepted, non-apocryphal heart of, whatever the concept is, in this case, the Star Trek franchise. And it has always been established and has long been the policy of CBS that what is Star Trek canon is live action, filmed episodes and feature films officially produced by CBS or by whoever the current license holder was for Star Trek at that time, going back to the original series, Next Gen, the spinoffs, the feature films, and to a lesser degree, the animated series. The animated series, even though it was on television, for a long time has been treated as soft canon.
Sure.
I think that we have been seeing a softening on that because there are many of us who write the Star Trek novels who have a deep love for the animated series, having watched it as kids and having had it imprint upon us like ducklings upon our, a parent duck.
Yeah.
And so in the novels, we have integrated elements, characters, species, events, bits of character lore from the animated series into the literary continuity.
Yeah.
And what we've had going on in the Star Trek novels since around 2003, since shortly, maybe a year after Nemesis went out of theaters, is a shared continuity within the books across all the different franchises, from original series to Next Gen, all the other 24th series, DS9, Voyager, including Enterprise, and then including the literary original series, such as Peter David's New Frontier series, Michael Jan Friedman's Stargazer books, the Vanguard series that I created with Marco Palmieri and wrote with Kevin Dilmore and Dayton Ward. and so on and so on. And the Voyager relaunch, the DS9 relaunch, they've all had a shared literary continuity where we've tried to make certain that when we could,
right,
the events that would happen to a character would have lasting consequences and would be reflected in the narratives of subsequent books. And that required a high degree of coordination between the editors and all the authors working on those books. It required authors to talk to each other a lot offline and sometimes in medias res while working on various books. Sometimes storylines had to be coordinated between authors to run over 3 or 4 different books over the course of 2 years or 3 years. We've also coordinated on a number of multi-book series. And so in that respect, we run a little bit like a writer's room and have been for about 15 or 16 years. And we were able to do that because at the time, after Nemesis, it seemed like, well, Next Gen's probably never coming back. It's over. It's done. They're not making any more feature films. They're not going to bring them back to TV. There were, at the time, there was no talk of even new feature films. The 2009 Star Trek feature film wasn't even a gleam in anybody's eye at that point.
Or a flare. You're right.
Or it wasn't even a lens flare in anybody's eye at that point. And so we were given a certain degree of carte blanche to alter the status quo of characters' lives, to have some characters die off, have others undergo big changes or radical alterations of their career tracks. And I thought it made for very dynamic, interesting storytelling that kept readers engaged because they suddenly realized, hey, we can do just about anything now.
Right.
These characters, aren't going to be put back in the box with the other toys exactly as you found them. There's going to be changes. And I feel like that made for some rather challenging fiction. It made for some interesting ideas that I think otherwise might not have gotten a chance to exist. And so we're all very proud of this shared literary creation we've had going. But one of the downsides to this revival of Star Trek on television, as wonderful as it is, and I'm glad to see it happening, one of the downsides for us who write the tie-in materials is that our shared literary continuity is going to be a casualty of this, because they're going to inevitably start establishing backstory details, especially on the Picard show, which is going to be set, ahead of our continuity in the 24th century.
Right.
They're going to start establishing details that radically conflict with what we established in the books, because the TV writers are trying to tell their own stories. They have their own dramatic needs.
Sure.
And those needs have to come first. They're the show.
Yeah. And
they've got to call the shots, and we have to follow their lead. So one of the things we have to expect is that starting around the end of this year, either the continuity we've been working on is just going to stop and we're going to have to shift gears and start writing books in the new continuity, or we're going to have to find some way to reconcile the changeover of continuity from one to the other. So we haven't really decided yet. There's been no firm decision that I know of for exactly how or when to deal with this, but I can tell it's coming.
Yeah. Well, in terms of then of Collateral Damage and any other books you might be doing going forward, are you already thinking about a way to sort of wind down or to wrap up your contributions in continuity to what you've written for the books?
There have been some conversations. In the case of Collateral Damage, this was more about really getting into the nitty-gritty of the fallout of the revelations that occurred in my book, Section 31,
right.
Control,
right.
in which, spoiler alert, for those of you out there who have not read it, the ending of the book is essentially about, Bashir sacrifices everything in his long-running quest to expose and take down 31, and he succeeds, but at a terrible price. Mm-hmm. And it costs him pretty much everything, his career, his reputation, the woman he loves, and eventually his own sanity. I mean, it takes him out of the game for a while. We don't know yet if Bashir's ever going to recover from what was done to him in that book. Mm-hmm. And so, but the fallout of exposing 31, all of its crimes, all the dirty things it's done, all the conspiracies it's been involved in over 2 centuries, the fact that a sociopathic artificial superintelligence has been running the Federation like a surveillance society for over 200 years and has infiltrated every single piece of technology, from your communicators, your replicators, your traffic control systems, your comm networks. And it basically is capable of watching and monitoring everybody and everything and killing people off independently when it has to.
Right.
This is a revelation that shocks the people of the Federation to their core. I mean, it's like, Mueller report times 50.
Right.
This would be like finding out that the United States has been being run by a demon living underneath the Pentagon, or living underneath the White House, like since the days of George Washington. And you go, what?
Yeah.
A demon has been running the country for 250 years?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
And it changes your entire conceptual notion of what your nation is, what your civilization is, what your society is. And so the people of the Federation are dealing with that after Control. And one of the things that comes out, and this is one of the fun things about this, is that there was a storyline we did back when we started the shared literary continuity back in 2004. It was my first 2 full-length paperback novels, A Time to Kill and A Time to Heal. They were part of a 9-book series referred to as A Time 2. And the purpose of that 9-book series was to chronicle the year in the life of the Enterprise crew in the year leading up to the movie Nemesis, so that we could understand why they underwent such a massive change in all of their status quo from where we saw them in Insurrection to where we found them in Nemesis. How did Worf go from being, the ambassador to Kronos that he was appointed to at the end of DS9 to back on the Enterprise bridge?
Right.
Why did Riker and Troy finally decide to get married? Why did Riker finally decide to accept his own command? What's going on with Data? All these sort of questions. How did this status quo get totally upended?
Sure.
Well, that was the purpose of the A Time 2 books. And my 2 entries, which were books 7 and 8 of this 9-book series, were pretty much a not so thinly veiled critique of the 2003 U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. And it sets up this whole sort of the first book, Time to Kill, is a fast-paced military techno-thriller. And it's basically about the Enterprise crew has to conquer this planet called Teswa, which has basically been getting uppity because it's got some pretty powerful super secret weapons it got from the Federation during the Dominion War that it really shouldn't have, and it just used them to kill 6,000 Klingons. And we've got to get involved before the Klingons find out that those were our weapons that killed their people. So we do that, and then A Time to Heal is all about the cover-up. And you find out that the cover-up goes to the top levels of the Federation government. It goes right to the office of the president, that there's criminal conspiracies. They're involving criminal elements like the Orion Syndicate to cover up what they did. It involves murder, blackmail, war crimes. I mean, it's horrendous. And by the end of it, our characters are put in the untenable position of having to say, well, what the hell are we supposed to do about it? And Picard, having his officers have dug up all this evidence, he does the only thing he can do. He goes to the ranking diplomatic officer of the Federation on the planet, the ambassador, shows her the evidence. She says, well, we should really talk to your superior officers. So they set up a call because, she would do it herself. She says, but you found all the evidence. I need you there to present the evidence. So they set up a call, via subspace with 5 admirals, 5 high-level admirals. And they basically all decide, and one of them is Admiral Ross, who we know from DS9 is in bed with Section 31.
Right.
They decide the president, Min Zaif, has to go. And if he won't go, he has to be told it's not an option. And this is pretty dangerous territory. Now you're veering into...
It's coup-ish.
It's coup-ish. The military's not taking control of the government, but they're making it clear to a sitting president, you need to step down.
Right.
Or else, and in exchange, we'll bury all the evidence of your war crimes.
Right.
So this is, some pretty dark territory. But the alternative is if they expose him and try to take him down by legal methods in the open, they'll spark a war with the Klingons and billions could die. So what do you do? I mean, there's no right answer. There's no good answer to this problem. And so they take him out and they think they're going to send him off into retirement. What they don't know is that Zaif, having very nearly brought the Federation to calamity, has so pissed off Section 31 that Section 31 takes custody of him after he resigns, and they assassinate him.
God.
And so now we've got this crime on the books to which Picard is an unwitting accessory.
Right.
And when Section 31 gets exposed in Control, it all comes out. Now it's all out there. Now there's got to be a tribunal. And so the directive I got from editorial was put Jean-Luc Picard on trial for what he did. So there's two plots basically running in Collateral Damage. One goes back to the Borg invasion of my Destiny trilogy, and there's some fallout from that involving the Nausicaans that has come back to roost after all these years. And that was sort of my critique on the way the U.S. bungled the recent need to provide aid to Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. And then the other sort of equal time plot is Picard facing what's called an Article 32 hearing. It's a military version of a preliminary hearing. Its purpose is to determine if there is sufficient evidence, credible evidence, to proceed to a general court-martial. It's a trial before the trial. Mm-hmm. And there's different rules of evidence, so I had to research how that all runs. So basically, Collateral Damage is about Picard on trial and the Enterprise crew off doing its thing while Picard is stuck in a courtroom. Okay. So that's how that all shook out. And the thing is, I mean, that's all basically part of tying up loose ends that have been sort of out there for 16 years or so, maybe 15 years of real time, and 6 years or so of story time in the shared continuity, maybe a little longer.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at, but we're not really yet prepared to deal with the burning down of the continuity in its entirety to make way for the new continuity that will be brought by the Picard show.
Sure. And hopefully it can end positively, because that all sounds really dark and a lot darker than what we generally see on screen in Trek. But I think it's likely what we could probably expect to get from the upcoming Section 31 series. As somebody who's written a lot for Section 31, what would you like to see out of a on-screen 31 series?
Well, I have to be a little circumspect about this. You're right in that I've actually written more about Section 31 in terms of words of narrative and plumbing the organization than anybody else who has ever written about Section 31, including the people who created it. Mm. And I'm actually hoping that will be enough to persuade the lovely Bowie Kim and Erica Lipple to maybe consider putting me in a chair in their writer's room one day.
Sure.
Well, so any ideas I might have about where that would go first, I don't want to step on their idea because they're going to be the showrunners. They've already got their idea. And I can tell that some of the seeds for that were planted in last night's Discovery finale.
Right.
But I do have some ideas for how it could play out. And I have always enjoyed writing espionage-style thrillers, and I've loved writing Section 31 stories with all the moral ambiguity that comes with them. I think as long as they remember that this is a morally ambiguous organization, that they are not supposed to be the heroes, that in many respects they are, in fact, an illegal operation. They think they're the heroes. They think they're doing good. But at some point, they've lost their moral compass, and they're going to have to realize that. Yeah,
and I can say something because I'll never write for this show, so it doesn't matter. But the impression that I was getting as it pertains to Tyler was that in an earlier episode, he seemed to think that he could change Section 31, like he wanted to do it again, but do it right. And I would love to see, and again, this is very sort of dark and depressing for Trek, but I'd love to see somebody like him who's really idealistic and kind of naive when you think about it, just be torn down and destroyed by the things that he has to do in the day-to-day operations of a organization like that. I think a Georgiou, whether she's really evil Georgiou or like fun Georgiou, could handle it, but just watching him just get pulled down by all this crap that they have to do and totally losing sight of his idealistic attitude about, maybe we can do this better.
Well, as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You start out wanting to do good, and before you know it, you've slid down a slippery slope into, horrendous evil. In fact, that was something I touched on in, a Star Trek novel I wrote called ZeroSum Game, which was part of the whole Section 31 arc that I was working on, in which Bashir is pulled into a Starfleet intelligence mission because he's genetically modified and they think he's got the best chance of going undercover in disguise into Breen society and blending in. And the whole novel, once you really get into it, is an indictment of the whole action spy thriller concept and the whole concept of good and evil. One of the things I tried to do with that book was flesh out the Breen society and the Breen people, to sort of show you that they are not this monolithic evil that we were given in the show. And that, in fact, Bashir, who thinks he's, doing the hero's work, when you really get down to it, he's doing some horrendous things in that book. He's killing hundreds of people, including civilians who were working on, Breen civilians who were working on this military project. And he rationalizes it as, I've got to do this or the mission fails. But at the end of the day, the most sympathetic character in the book is a Breen engineer who was just trying to do his job and winds up, getting killed with everybody else. And so I make the most sympathetic characters in the book are the Breen who are getting killed.
Yeah, right.
And I did it on purpose. The whole point is that the people you think of as heroes and the people you think of as villains, it's all completely relative. That's, I think, a theme for a Section 31 show. Yeah.
Well, this episode that we're talking about today is not quite as dark as that in terms of theme. It's, of course, Starship Down. Season 4 of DS9 is presented as an interlude of sorts in the run of DS9. It introduces Worf and the conflict with the Klingons and sidelines the Bajoran and the Cardassian politics that would later occupy the Dominion War arc. And for that reason, I feel like it gets passed over a lot. I feel like it doesn't get mentioned in the same breath as later seasons of the show. But at this point, the show, like most Trek shows at this point, has gotten very good at what it does. And I think that it's a season that's full of solid hours of Trek. And this is one of them. And other than the inclusion of the Jem'Hadar, in this case, there's nothing that really anchors this episode specifically to the fourth season. It's just a solid and entertaining ensemble piece. And that really stands out, I think, as one of the great standalone episodes of DS9. And that's why I wanted to talk about it.
Wow. That's high praise. I'm not sure it qualifies as one of the great episodes of DS9 unless we're being very expansive in our definition. It's certainly not up there with in the Pale Moonlight or The Visitor or anything like that. But I mean, it held its own, I think, in terms of just action quotient and being a fun hour of TV. And it was up against, or it was in the mix with certain episodes like Our Man Bashir and Rejoined, which are great episodes. I mean, just fabulous episodes.
Yeah.
Little Green Men, I think, aired either the week before or the week after.
Right after, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it was part of a season that, for me, that was DS9 firing on all thrusters. It hadn't yet bogged down into the Dominion War that would dominate from like late season 5 through the end of the series.
Sure.
It was at a point in the show where they were past their growing pains and they were still able to have fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the whole thing started out as just, a simple action pitch. I just wanted to do an action oriented episode. And it all started with, I just watched the movie Das Boot, the director's edition.
Okay.
And the next day I was stuck in traffic on the BQE with my writing partner, John Ordover. And I looked at John and I said, I want to sink the Defiant. And he said, okay, what's the story? And off the top of my head, I just start railing off this story, simple idea. They're in the Gamma Quadrant to negotiate some sort of a trade deal. The Jem'Hadar attack. We use the atmosphere of a gas giant to simulate an underwater environment. It turns into a submarine battle. Damage mounts, casualties mount. We're hanging on by a thread, and it's just like Das Boat, where you think you're sunk, you fight your way back from the bottom, you come out victorious, and then you break the surface and you head for home. And he's like, okay, let's figure out what the character beats are and what's driving the engine of it, and we'll put it on the pitch list. And then I went out to a vacation, and I wrote up a more detailed treatment of it. And then eventually we had our phone call where we pitched it, and they loved it based on the elevator pitch. We said, Defiant does Das Boat. We sink the Defiant. They go, that's great. Tell me more. And we hooked them with that one right off the bat from the first call. And they were like, sold. We'll buy that one. I'm like, all right.
Now, at this point, are you in a position where you can, within reason, just sort of call them up and pitch them things?
Well, it was an interesting situation that led to me and John working together in the first place. I started submitting spec scripts when Next Gen had its open door policy starting after season 2.
Right.
Which was roughly 1988.
Right.
At the time, I was in NYU film school. Mm-hmm. And so I was trained in screenwriting and teleplay writing. And I thought, lifelong Star Trek fan, I thought I could do this. So I wrote a bunch of scripts. And I'd submit them one at a time, and I'd collect my rejection letters, and I'd write another one and get another rejection letter. And I did this for years. Never got out of the slush pile on TNG. And I kept going because they kept the same policy in place on DS9. And I'd submit, and I'd get my rejection, and I'd try again. And I had another writing partner who I worked with for a time, and that didn't work out. And I finally went solo, and I was developing some ideas. And this would have been around 93, 94, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And my best friend from college at the time started going to this regular Wednesday lunch of publishing professionals from the science fiction and fantasy publishing industry in New York. He said, you should really start coming to this lunch. There's editors there, other writers, there's agents, there's people you could meet. It'd be a good networking opportunity. Sure. He says, including this guy, John Ordover, who at the time was one of the editors acquiring for Star Trek Fiction at Simon & Schuster. Mm-hmm. So I go to this lunch thinking, I'm going to pitch John a Star Trek novel. And I'm pretty sure I've got the greatest idea for a Star Trek novel that's ever been. And I go and I meet him at lunch, and he says he'll bring me a copy of the writer's guidelines for the novel. So I keep working on my pitch. I go the next week. He gives me the guidelines. I take them home. I read the guidelines for the Star Trek novels, for people who have never sold a Star Trek novel before. There are very strict guidelines for spec submissions, or at least there were at that time. And I went through them, and I kid you not, I discovered I had violated every single thing they tell you not to do. Like they have a bullet list that fills a whole page of, here's what we don't want to see. We don't want the following. And bullet point by bullet point all the way down the page, I went, yeah, did that. Yeah, I got that. Yeah, did that. And
these are things like don't introduce new Riker's brother comes on. Yeah, right.
Yeah, don't introduce new family members. We're tired of time travel unless there's a really good reason for it. Don't kill off any existing characters. Don't do this, don't do that. We're not interested in stories about this. We're not interested in war stories, this, that, the other thing. And it's just this grocery list of things that they absolutely did not want to see in a pitch. And I hit every single one. And I was like, I'm a savant. This is amazing. I don't know how I did this.
Doing something right.
Well, we're doing something really wrong. So I took my pitch and I threw it in the trash. I deleted the files and then I burned all the hard copies so that it could never be found and used against me.
Oh no.
I'm serious. I burned those pages. They're never coming back. And I kept going to lunch though. And I kept working on my spec scripts for DS9, and I would tell John about them, and he would say, oh, well, actually, I'm on the script distribution list at the Star Trek books office, and 5 weeks from now, they're doing this in an episode. So you probably don't want to do that with your script because they're going to step all over it in continuity. I go, oh, that's a good note. Thanks for telling me that.
Sure.
And at one point, he looked at me and he said, weren't you going to give me a pitch for a Star Trek novel? I said, I was, and then I read your writer's guidelines. I found out I violated every single thing you said not to do, and I just decided not to waste your time with it. He looked at me and said, there are professional writers who are not that considerate. And that led to me and John becoming friends. And then at one point, a couple months later, he's continuing to give me feedback on these spec script ideas of mine. And at one point, I'm showing him the script and we're talking about it, and he's giving me notes on every page. I go, if you're going to give me this many damn notes, we might as well just write the thing together.
Right.
And he goes, and dead serious, he goes, why don't we? I went, what do you mean? He says, here's the thing that drives me crazy. He says, I've got an open invitation to pick up the phone to the producers and pitch whenever I feel like it. And I could sell a story and maybe make a few $1,000s, get a story credit if I'm lucky. Right. He says, but I don't know anything about how to write a screenplay. I get them every day. I read them. I don't know how to write them. I don't have the patience for this. I go, well, that's what I'm trained for. That's my degree. And I was like, so you've got the access and I've got the training. If we teamed up, chocolate and peanut butter, this could work. So we team up, and I put us through our paces. I know that the rules at that time were for freelancers. If you pitch a story as a freelancer and they say, all right, we're going to buy it, here's the outline, We've agreed this is the outline for the story. Here's the beat sheet for the story. I knew what all these things were. Mm-hmm. Once your beat sheet is locked and everybody has agreed that's the structure of the story, go write the script. You have 2 weeks from that day to turn in your manuscript.
Okay.
So I knew these were the rules. So I would go through the process with John. I'd say, all right, let's argue out a story outline. Now let's argue it into a beat outline form and talk about how it falls into an act-by-act structure. And I'd say, all right, we're locked. We have 2 weeks from today to produce what we consider as a professional quality teleplay.
Sure.
I'm going to go to work and I'll get you pages for editorial notes. We did this 3 times just to prove to ourselves that we could do it consistently and produce quality product.
Okay.
We did that 3 times before we scheduled a pitch. So we were confident that we had our act
time
together.
trials. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we wanted to make sure that we were going to be ready, that if we got the call, we weren't going to fumble it,
right?
In front of everybody.
Right.
So we had our working relationship worked out. He got us the pitch meeting. Our first call was to Voyager. We made a sale off the bat in that first call.
Sure.
And then we had the call a week later with DS9, and they said, we'll take Starship Down. And there was another one. They said, we like that one, but we're not sure what to do with it. They sat on it for 3 years. They eventually bought it. It became Paper Moon, but that started out as something very different. Mm-hmm. But that's how this all came together, was me and John just sort of becoming friends over lunch. He had access. I had the training. We basically trained ourselves to make sure we were ready to work at a professional level if we got the opportunity.
Right.
And then we got lucky on our first couple of pitches, and then unfortunately never got that lucky again.
Yeah, well, I guess that happens. I love the setup and the whole situation of the episode, because whenever Trek leans into its naval roots, I really enjoy that sort of thing. Like when we get a similar situation to this in Balance of Terror, which evokes the idea of a World War II submarine movie, or something like Wrath of Khan. I love those situations. And I also love the innovation of making it a gas giant. I mean, we're lousy with ships hiding or fighting in nebulas in Trek, and it's the high pressure atmosphere of a gas giant. It does really feel like the deep water of space to me, that sort of threat that you've got in these sub battles where we can't go too low, or we'll be crushed. So I just thought that was a really great adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved those episodes myself. Balance of Terror was always one of my favorites. Wrath of Khan is a favorite. And of course, as I said, the whole thing was inspired by Das Boot. Right. Which is this classic German, film by Wolfgang Petersen, I believe. And it's very much an anti-war movie, about the sort of just these guys who have to survive aboard a U-boat during World War II.
Yeah.
And what I loved about the story, again, I know enough about science to know that in space, a nebula is actually a pretty tenuous mass. It's not very dense. You're not really going to be able to hide in a nebula, despite what Star Trek has shown you.
Right.
You really
you might not know you were in a nebula if you were in a nebula. Yeah.
And in fact, I knew enough about the science of, say, gas giants to know that high pressure atmosphere, like, it is gaseous at the uppermost levels, but as you go deeper, it not only becomes more like a fluid, right, and at some point it becomes a liquid metal, superheated due to pressure and friction. It's a remarkably deadly, dangerous environment. And it worked great on paper. Here was the problem, which we found out all too late, is that simulating that incredibly dangerous environment realistically was beyond the capacity of a 1995 TV budget.
Okay.
And so the special effects in this episode, to be perfectly frank, do not live up to the real threat that would be posed by a gas giant at the depths these guys were going to.
Sure.
Like, it basically just looks like a smoke effect. Smoke is pouring into the Actually, what it would be the equivalent of molten lead pouring into your corridor.
Right.
They couldn't afford that.
Yeah.
and they didn't want to have their characters getting scorched down to their skeletons.
Right. Yeah. I thought that it came off okay for a syndicated TV show in the 90s. I thought it's kind of like the theater of imagination. Like,
they did what they could.
Yeah, right. And I get that we're subbing gas for water in this case. You always have that classic scene in those submarine movies where a compartment is flooding. And
you've got to shut that hatch.
That's an order. Yeah, the captain's got to make that call.
we tried to have one of those. It was in one of our early or maybe our original draft, and that got cut. That didn't survive.
Though it's sort of in the what's on screen still, because we get that.
There is a similar moment, but it lacks all poignancy because with the gas, it just doesn't play. I'm sorry. I know they did the best they could.
They do well.
and it's our fault. I mean, I should have realized, what we were dealing with, and I should have come up with something different.
Yeah.
But the problem is that we were allowed to write the first draft, but all subsequent rewrites were taken out of our hands and executed in basically the panic mode that all TV shows get into.
Sure.
Once, to give you an idea of what the mood was like, when we turned in our script precisely on time, the response from supervising producer Hans Beimler was, "Oh, good. Now the writing can start." And that's the most heartbreaking thing you can ever hear as a writer. You've spent 2 weeks crafting and polishing your perfect draft, and you're told, "Oh, good, now the writing can start."
Right.
And all the rewrites were handled in house by Renee Echeverria, and I guess he was basically getting notes from everybody on staff, the showrunner, the other producers, the technical advisors, and he's got his own stuff he's trying to work on. He's got his own episodes he's trying to get written. And here he's stuck doing an uncredited series of like 6 or 7 rewrites on this script from us. And I imagine that couldn't have been very fun for him.
And when rewrites like that happen, I mean, it is nothing wrong with your work necessarily, but it's probably them rewriting it because they know the specs of their production and also trying to bring...
Yeah, it's the collaborative process of TV. It's you get the script, and even though we delivered exactly beat for beat what we were told to deliver...
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things where once you sort of see it all laid out and you look at it, you go, yeah, that didn't play the way we thought it was going to. We need to change this.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other concepts, I forget who said it, but it was one of the guys on staff at the time. He gave a quote to either the DS9 companion or something else. I think it was the DS9 companion, where he said, yeah, it was a fantastic first draft, and if we'd had $100 million, we would have shot it.
Okay. Sure. That's a great movie. It's a great blockbuster movie. It's not a TV show.
They said this is a great first draft, and if we'd had $100 million, we would have shot it. And that was really the problem, is we got overly ambitious with what we were trying to do. It was a great script. It worked terrific on paper, but when the actual budgeting team went through and said, do you have any idea what it'll cost to do this one shot? Do you have any? This is the whole budget right here. A shot.
Yeah. You
can't do this. And we thought we were pitching a bottle show, with simple, cheap effects.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Little did we know what we had done. We ended up burning through a ton of their money for this ridiculous thing.
Well, this was apparently one of the first Trek episodes to heavily feature CGI. All the ships and clouds are computer generated, and I think that those exterior scenes look pretty good. There's a part when that second Jem'Hadar ship is destroyed and the gas clouds kind of puff out from the explosion, and it looks really cool.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they did some pretty good stuff with that. There were a few moments that were a little confusing, like the whole resolution of the episode, the action sequence with finding the buoy that lures in the Jem'Hadar and sets them up so that our heroes can pounce on them from behind. The problem was that the plan was never adequately explained because they were trying to have it be a surprise, but at the same time they wanted it to be clear. They tried to have their cake and eat it too, and as a result, the first time I ever watched that sequence, it was very confusing. I'm like, and there were a lot of people watching the episode with me and John as it was broadcast, and we all had the same reaction, which was, what just happened?
Right.
What did they do? What was that thing? Was that our thing or their thing? What was that? How did that happen? What was that?
I guess they won, yeah.
I guess we won. We're alive. They're dead. Okay.
Yeah.
Yay! So there were confusing moments. I mean, some bits of it work better than others. You've got the whole Dax and Bashir stuck in the turbo lift thing and having to cuddle, for which I've always felt Alexander Siddig should have sent me a thank you note.
Sure.
He never has. He's never thanked me, not once.
That was ungrateful swine.
Grateful swine. But I've always loved the bit. Here's a funny tidbit from both the story pitch and the first draft.
Sure.
The Karma negotiator, Hannock, who was brilliantly played by James Cromwell.
Yes.
That role was originally written as a woman, a female Karma, who was supposed to be flirting with Quark as they're dealing with the defusing of the torpedo.
Okay.
So that was all written originally for a female character, and I guess a decision was either made that they didn't think that worked, and so they changed it to a male character to improve the conflict between the characters so that there was somewhere better for them to go, a resolution, a catharsis to their working relationship by the end of the episode.
Right.
So, I mean, there were a lot of changes that happened like that. The other thing that drove me crazy, and this is sort of an interesting parallel to Discovery, when we were in the room doing the break session, where we have like our original story pitch that we've given to them by phone, we have our 5 or 6 page story breakdown that everybody in the room has, and you go in to break the episode. And breaking the episode happens after you've sold the initial pitch, and you've got maybe a 5 or 6 page story outline. That's when whoever's available from the writing team, you try to have the whole room if you can, but sometimes people are busy. They're working on their script and they can't be disturbed or whatever. But it was us, Ira Stephen Bear, Hans Beimler, Robert Hewitt-Wolf, Ron Moore. We're in the room with the big long whiteboard, and that's where you start breaking it down. Like, this is going to be the teaser. This is Act 1. This is going to be our stinger to go out of Act 1.
Sure.
Here's how we open Act 2. And you go, Act 2, Scene 1, here's how it breaks down. This is the idea for this scene. Oh, let's move that around. Actually, let's move that up. Actually, can we strike that? And you do this all day. And it took us about a day or two to break the episode. And while we were in the room, and the story starts to mutate. This is where ideas start to get thrown out to say, hey, what if we did this? Or, hey, how about that? Hey, here's an idea. What if instead of this, we did that? And one thing they came up with was, we would like to have a new sort of a command character who we're planning to develop, a guy named Tyler. The name Tyler apparently just keeps coming up in Star Trek for some reason. We have this guy named Tyler we want you to work in. And John and I looked at each other. We're like, really, this guy we've never heard of who's not one of your series regulars? Shouldn't we really be focusing more on Worf? I mean, Worf is your new addition, and we're going to want to see how he... There you go. No. Don't worry about that. We've got this stuff over here for Worf, but we need you to do this with Tyler. We really want Tyler, because it's going to be about Tyler and Sisko and this, and we're like, all right, who the hell is Tyler? And they go, well, we haven't cast him yet, but we have this great idea. We're going to be doing this whole arc with Tyler. All right. So we write this thing. And, of course, we have the whole bit for Tyler just as it's discussed in the room during the break. And by the time they've done the first rewrite, Tyler is gone.
Tyler's out.
Tyler doesn't exist anymore. Tyler? Who the fuck is Tyler? What's this guy doing here? We don't know who Tyler is. So one of the other interesting things about Starship Down, when Worf is dealing with O'Brien and the engineers, this is one of the first explicit mentions in Star Trek canon that there are enlisted personnel on board.
Right.
There are not many explicit references to enlisted men, but the engineers, played by F.G. Rio and another guy, Stevens and Muniz, I think are the two guys.
That's right.
Stevens and Muniz are specifically described by Chief O'Brien, who's a non-commissioned officer. He describes them as, these are enlisted men. They didn't go to Starfleet Academy.
Right.
That's the first explicit mention we have that there's essentially something like Starfleet boot camp. There's Starfleet basic training. There's Starfleet, enlisted engineering. There's, enlisted men, and then they move up to the petty officer ranks, which, of course, obviously has to exist. Otherwise, how do you get Chief O'Brien?
So they are enlisted, or are these just like tech contractors or something like that serving on the ship?
Well, tech contractor would be done differently. That would be a chief warrant officer.
Oh.
The Navy recruits highly trained professionals for things like information warfare officers, medical specialties, legal specialties, techs. These guys are brought in. Usually they're promoted out of the chief petty officer ranks. They go to officer training, and they come back as chief warrant officers. Okay. Or you can be granted a warrant by Starfleet, or in this case, the U.S. Navy, for your technical specialty. There used to be 4. There's now, again, 5 levels of chief warrant officer grade. They're considered officers, although technically in the military hierarchy, they rank below ensigns.
Okay. That makes sense.
So above chiefs, but below ensigns. They are highly trained technical specialists. They tend to be tasked with mission-specific duties, although in some cases they are tasked with training ensigns who are, being prepared to serve as unrestricted line warfare officers.
Sure. I always like it when we get to see minor characters and they get lines like Muniz and Stevens. And it's usually because, I don't know what their plans would have been for Tyler, but it's usually because they're going to get gut shot like Muniz does later in the episode The Ship. But it always...
I'm so sad about that.
Yeah, it does make the crew seem more real. And I feel like we get a lot of those extra characters in DS9.
Yeah, and it's fun. Here's a couple of other fun notes. The character of Stevens, who was one of the enlisted engineers in this episode, later became a series regular character in the Star Trek literary series Corps of Engineers,
sure,
created by John Ordover, my writing partner on this episode, and Keith R.A. DeCandido, who was working as both an editor and an author for Star Trek at that time. And I ended up writing some of my first work in prose fiction was for Corps of Engineers, writing once again for this character among others who never appeared before my episode. So Stevens gets to live on, and in fact it was in the Corps of Engineers series of ebooks that my first work of solo prose, where I was working alone and not with a writing partner, was called Wildfire. It was a short novel.
Right. And
in many ways Wildfire is what I wish Starship Down had been.
Okay.
It is essentially a disaster story in which our hero ship, the Da Vinci, is sent to go in and perform rescue and or salvage operations for a Starfleet ship that has gone missing during a technical or scientific research operation, the Orion. And the Orion's been lost in a gas giant.
Right.
This time, because I'm not restricted by a TV budget, I'm able to make that environment as horrific and as deadly as it ought to be, because I'm not worried about whether it costs $100 million anymore.
Right.
So now I've got, superheated liquid metal surging through corridors, vaporizing crewmen on contact. I've got the seal that hatch and you hear somebody getting, crushed and vaporized on the other side of the hatch. I've got the ship stripped down to space frame. The captain loses his hand. Half the crew is killed. A major character dies at the end of it. It's just, and the whole thing is just unrelenting tragedy. It's just a brutal tragedy that has maybe a little bit of a silver lining at the end, but it comes out, there's no happy ending. They spent the next 4 to 8 books of the series dealing with the emotional aftermath and the post-traumatic disorder of the characters who survived it.
Sure.
So, and this was, where I got the nickname Angel of Death.
You're right.
But that particular book grew out of my frustration with the limitations of what I couldn't do in Starship Down.
Yeah. Did you know from the start that you wanted it to be an ensemble piece where the crew is paired off and they each sort of get their own story?
Yeah, I kind of had that feeling that was where it was going to go, because that's the classic paradigm of the submarine, the stranded submarine or the sunken submarine. Is
the Poseidon Adventure type thing.
Yeah, you've got your people cut off in different portions of the ship. So you've got your people on the bridge or in the command information center who, are trying to get answers out of anybody. They're trying to do what they can to save the ship, coordinate action, but they're cut off in their little area. Then you've got the guys who are trying to survive in an area that's slowly flooding. Or then you've got the engineers who are trying to restore power. You've got the guys who are trying to get the torpedoes to actually load again.
Right.
Then you got somebody who's stranded somewhere else and they don't know if somebody's going to find them before the air runs out. It's a classic paradigm.
Sure.
And it allowed us to sort of take characters who, for whatever reason, had issues and force them together. And it's the beginning of Worf learning to realize this is what it's going to mean to be in command. If you're going to actually command and wear command red, you've got to learn to do your job differently. Mm-hmm. You are not just a security officer anymore. You're not just here to arrest people. Yeah. You're not here to investigate. If you're going to command, you got to know that this is about motivating people. It's about giving people confidence. It's about code switching and learning to talk to enlisted men one way, a chief another, an officer another, and doing what you got to do to get everybody to work together.
Yeah.
So he's got his great storyline going on with Chief O'Brien, and it's sort of classic. Once again, a chief is training an officer, which is classic Navy.
Right.
And then the one storyline that kind of caught us a little out of the blue when it was pitched in the room, but we did our best with it, is the whole bit with Kira and Sisko and the head wound. I was not thrilled with the notion of taking Sisko, one of the most dynamic characters in the series, and essentially taking him out of commission for the bulk of the episode. But I do have to appreciate what was found in pairing him off with Kira, and Kira has to go from dealing with this guy who she kind of reveres as a semi-religious figure.
Right.
And suddenly she's got to relate to him as a man, as just a, as one person to another, as he's lying there dying in front of her.
Yeah. Having to work with him day in and day out, it must be such a strange experience for her. And I think I read somebody describe it once as like working in Jesus's carpentry shop.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus is your foreman in a furniture shop.
Yeah. Right.
That was an interesting relationship to sort of explore.
Yeah. And of those pairings, I think that Hanuk and Quark is probably my favorite one. Of course, you've got two amazing actors sharing the screen. And it's my favorite Quark is the Quark who sometimes we see Quark be scared of new opportunity. We see him kind of screw up and he's got kind of a loser thing going on. But I like it when Quark is sort of riding the wave. And I like the fact that Hanuk catches Quark basically cheating him, and Quark just decides, all right, this is it. He caught me with my hand in the cookie jar, but I'm going to sell this guy. I'm Shelley Levine. Come on, risk is fun. He's going to try to convert this guy, to his way of living.
He sells him on gambling.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But also because it's the only way they're going to survive with diffusing the torpedo.
Yes.
That comes. And one of my favorite moments in the whole episode, I wish I had been the one who had actually written this exchange, but I have to give the credit to Renee, is when they're looking at the torpedo and they have the realization of, I think Hanuk says something about, well, you got to do this and disconnect that. And he goes, how do you know so much about this torpedo? Well, my people manufacture these or sell these to the Jem'Hadar. And Quark looks at him and says, wasn't it supposed to explode on impact? Do you think I should offer them a refund?
Right.
And they look at each other and they just start to laugh.
Right.
They cackle maniacally at each other because they both realize, oh my God, this is so ridiculous. We're arguing over a torpedo that's sticking down, and then it suddenly makes a change in its sound, and they both stop laughing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great scene.
They go, it's really not funny.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, in last night's season finale of Discovery, there was a scene where a torpedo has penetrated the ship, and they have to deal with that.
God, they just keep raiding my toy
box. I know. We got to talk to somebody about this.
Like they keep doing the Dave Mack Greatest Hits show.
Yeah.
And I'm getting nothing here.
I'm loving it, though. I think I read something from Keith somewhere where he said that he did a table read with you guys on an early draft of the script. Is that something that you like to do to sound it out early on?
Yeah, in fact, John and I thought that since we had done so much of our early collaboration and had formed our partnership over this Wednesday lunch, which at that time would, gather anywhere from, 8 to 10 or even more people every week, every Wednesday at this particular place, we thought, well, why don't we bring this rough draft before we submit it? These people all watch DS9. Let's assign characters and let's do a table read at lunch and see how it sounds. See if the voices come through even when they're not being read by the actors.
Sure.
And that was helpful. It was like, yeah, that does sound like Worf. Yes, that sounds like Kira. That's good. And that was a fun thing to do. And it was just great because everybody there kind of got to be part of the process. And they were at the premiere party with us when the episode came out many months later.
Sure.
So yeah, I remember doing the table read. I remember after the break session when we went out. Actually, this would have been before the table read. When we went out, we did the break session in L.A., and then we came back, and we had picked up some swag at the Paramount gift shop or whatever on our way off the lot. And we came back, John and I, with matching blue Paramount Studios hats. And we went into the Wednesday lunch, both of us wearing sunglasses and our blue Paramount Studio hats, and we made a very visible point of not sitting with the other guys and sitting, in our own booth, like, one row away. And the other guys were like, oh, it's like that now, is it? And then somebody took us down a peg. I think it was Keith who said, well, this diner must be good if truckers eat here.
Did you at any point consider showing us what was happening on the Karema or the Jem'Hadar ships, or was that too much?
It was too much. We had all these different sort of storylines going with everybody separated into different parts of the ship.
Yeah.
There are only so many pages. There's only so many screen minutes available. And at that time, I don't think they had really established or had wanted to establish too much about the Jem'Hadar.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know that they had standing sets yet for Jem'Hadar ship interiors.
Okay, sure. Okay.
They might have. I'd have to check, but I don't know if they did. I know that they had not established any type of particular look for the Karama or their ships, and I know they did not want to spend money on a Karama ship interior because set construction is one of the single largest costs on any episode of this type. Special effects are expensive, but they are nothing compared to building sets. Sure. Sets cost a fortune. They take a ton of time. You don't build a set unless you absolutely have to, which is why they were buying bottle shows and why this started out as a bottle pitch with everything shot on the standing Defiant sets.
Right.
So, no, at no point did we really give any thought to humanizing or showing the Jem'Hadar characters, which would have made it a little more like Balance of Terror.
Yeah.
But I think the whole point of like Balance of Terror is that it's a battle of wits specifically between Kirk on one side and the Romulan commander on the other. And that's how they're selling it. That was the whole structure of that episode, was that parallel. And as such, they were able to focus the story, and it made it worthwhile to build the Romulan sets, which I think they knew they were going to get some use out of again.
Yeah.
They could redress it from Klingon sets or whatever. But that was not the purpose of Starship Down. So I think that there would have been no point to building Karama or Jem'Hadar ship interiors.
Yeah. And at this point, we're not ready to identify with the Jem'Hadar yet. They're still the sort of faceless stormtroopers of the Dominion and scary.
You got it.
Something else that I really like about this episode, as we wrap up here, is that it takes the time to give us a nice denouement. It's only natural because we want to see the results of all these storylines that we're following. But so often Trek episodes just end with, well, we fixed the problem, or, oh, that's sad, and then credits, and we leave.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that we get to go back one more time and just touch on everybody.
Yeah, I think I like the whole notion of you've got Dax getting in like one last little jab at Bashir.
Yeah.
You've got, Hanok has developed not only a taste for gambling, but a flair for it. And Quark realizes he may have created a monster.
Yeah.
You got the engineers who, think they're going to put one over on Worf, and Worf has clearly settled into command mode.
Right.
And then best of all is just that little moment with Kira and Sisko right at the end, with the fact that you realize he was on some level listening to her the whole time about changing to a 4-shift rotation. And then she thinks it's all work. And, she's been lamenting the fact that she never gets to spend time with him on a personal level. And he invites her to come to a holosuite baseball game with him.
Right. Yeah.
And he throws her a baseball hat, and she puts on the baseball hat, and it ends. And this was one of those things that was in my and John's draft, and John and I always loved this, was the idea of ending the episode on Sisko with his baseball and a smile. Because one of the things he and I always loved about the original series was that so many of those episodes would end with a push in on Kirk in the command chair and a smile.
Sure, yeah.
That was the charm of a lot of those early TOS episodes. We're like, I want that for Sisko. I want Sisko to have that Kirk moment.
Yeah.
That's even how we talked about it in the room. We end on Sisko having a Kirk moment with his baseball and a smile, comfortable in his chair, comfortable in his command. And they were like, that's great.
That's a great moment. I am somewhat grossed out by the idea, though, that Quark might have like a hot dog cart in the back where those dogs have just been in that water for weeks and weeks until Sisko asks for one.
Well, I mean, they're probably going to be simulated by a replicator in the holosuite, but if Quark is programming them, God only knows what's in those wings.
I don't think that those are 100% beef for sure.
Probably not. Those are not ballpark Franks, brother.
If there's anything, I mean, there's probably a lot of things, and we've talked about some of your regrets, but if there's like one thing that you could do differently, even if you could change the laws of the universe about this episode, what would it be?
Well, that's hard to say. I think, obviously I wish the effects could have been better, but knowing that they were limited, I wish that I would have had a chance to go through and just suggest changing it so that the effect was that the gases were toxic rather than pressurized, making it so that the problem is that they are, a combination of poison or whatever. Just making it clear that, since we can't do the kind of, dramatic effect of water flooding in, and we can't do the high pressure gas giant liquefied atmosphere that, that I thought the story called for.
Right.
It would have been really important to sell the danger of this toxic atmosphere. And I think they did that to a degree, but I think it could have been done better. Alternatively, there's so many little things. I guess maybe it would have been helpful if there had been a sense of more casualties. I feel like they got out of this light. Like, I don't remember hearing of anybody actually coming out on the other side of this dead.
I think in the bridge scene, after the bridge kind of blows up, there is one scene where somebody's like, oh, those other two extras are both dead. But otherwise, yeah, I don't think they even had names.
Yeah, these are guys without names, and I feel like, the death felt impersonal and distant, and there was just a sense of, I don't know, I guess it needed more of a sense of impending threat. I guess something about the action quotient of it just never quite felt right to me. Mm-hmm. And again, but that was, again, what inspired me to write Wildfire and kind of set me down the whole literary path.
And there's plenty of death and threat coming in later seasons at DS9 as well.
Yeah, it's not like they shied away from it. It's just this was not the time for it. They wanted a light, fun action episode. I guess it was one of those moments where Das Boat is so intense.
Yeah.
And I was looking for that level of intensity. And the problem, of course, is that, well, you can be that intense when you're shooting in an actual German U-boat with a steady cam and you've got, a budget of $40 or $50 million.
Right.
When you're shooting a TV episode for $2 or $3 million and you've got 1 week to shoot, you get your coverage and you move on.
Yeah.
And it's not their fault. They produced a pretty good episode in very little time and on budget, and that's that counts as a win.
Yeah.
And it got me and John our first writing credit, and I don't know. I guess if I had any regrets, I have fewer regrets about this. I mean, just because it was so heavily rewritten, even though it has written by David Mack and John J. Ordover, we contributed very little to the final script on this, to be perfectly honest. We were involved in development right up through the first draft, and then for reasons of production expediency, someone else had to take over because there just was no time to have us come back to L.A. to handle rewrites. If we had been based in L.A., they might have let us,
right.
But we were based in New York, so it just didn't work.
Yeah.
Ironically, it's only a Paper Moon, the season 7 episode, on which John and I share story credit. More of the work we did on our final story outline at Ron Moore's request, more of what we wrote in that outline made it onto the screen, either in terms of visuals or in terms of dialogue, than anything we did on Starship Down. Even though we only have story credit on Paper Moon, more of that episode is ours than not.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And not to ruin the future show where I have you come back and talk about Paper Moon, but did you always plan on having it be Nog being injured and then and convalescing?
No, in fact, that episode started out as a pitch that we gave at the same time we pitched Starship Down.
Yeah.
And the original version of the pitch, which we'll talk about in greater depth at some later time, was, again, a bottle show because we were trying to sell bottle shows.
Yeah.
As a freelancer, that's how you make your bones, or at least that's how you did back in the 90s. You would look at the standing stats and the standing cast, and you would try to do bottle shows that would be cheap to produce. And we thought, what would be cheaper to produce than a whole episode shot on one stage? So we pitched an episode called Everybody Comes to Quarks,
okay,
which is a play on Everybody Comes to Rick's, the play on which Casablanca is based.
Right.
And the whole idea
there was no Vix, of course, because this is way
there was no Vix.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry. I remember we're pitching before season 4. Vix doesn't exist yet.
Right.
So we pitched an episode called Everybody Comes to Quarks, And the idea was that you've got multiple interleaving stories going in and out, but for various reasons, Quark's is the only establishment on the promenade open on that day because of various alien holidays that have all coincided. So nothing else is open. The Replimat is closed. And there's a failure going on in the station systems. The replicators are down, but the engineers, the Bajoran engineers, are all on holiday. None of them will fix it.
Right. So
the only place you can get anything to eat on the entire station is Quark's.
Okay.
So everybody's in there. The place is packed. And, you got people with days off. They're celebrating the holiday. Sisko and Jake are in one of the holosuites replaying a World Series game as members of the team. You've got O'Brien and Bashir sort of holding court and doing a darts tournament against people from some other ship. You've got Dax trying to, have a date that keeps getting interrupted with somebody. You've got this, that, the other thing, and just multiple things going in and out, chaos, like an episode of Cheers in Quark's.
Right.
And so that's how that whole thing started. And by the time and they loved the original pitch, they just weren't sure where they would use it. But they loved the idea, and they loved the notion of course, a bottle show in Quark's.
Yeah.
Great idea. But they said, well, put it in a folder, and we'll come back to it. And they would come back to it in internal meetings that we had no idea about.
Okay.
And over the course of 3 years, they would say, well, get that folder out. What about this? What if we did this and this? And I go, oh, well, that's interesting, but I'm still not sure it works. Well, write it down. They would write it down. Okay. All right, close the folder, put it back.
Right.
And they do this off and on for 3 years until finally it mutated into, well, you know what we can do? I mean, if we want to do the follow-up thing, to Siege of AR 558, we got to do the whole Nog thing. Mm-hmm. That could be our bottle show in Quark's. They go, yeah, but we spent all this money on the Vic Fontaine set. All right, so go in and change it from Quark's to Vic Fontaine's.
Sure.
Go, all right. So all right. So what do we need now? Well, we need Mack and Ordover to rewrite the outline.
Right.
And so that's how that happened. And unfortunately, once it changed from Quark's to Vic's, we lost one of the best bits I've never gotten to write. I consider this like the lost scene. One of the favorite moments from the Everybody Comes to Quark's pitch is a moment where Quark is trying to do a dirty deal to buy some rare Klingon artifact that he knows he can flip for a huge profit. But if a Klingon sees him handling this thing, he's a dead man.
Okay.
All right? He's got the buyer coming in any minute. And, of course, that's the exact moment Worf comes in looking to have lunch.
Right.
So Worf comes to the counter and tries to order lunch. And Quark has got to find a way to make Worf go away without Worf getting suspicious. So we end up doing the Star Trek version of Monty Python's Cheese Shop sketch, where we go through every canonical food item ever mentioned in Star Trek. Worf tries to order everything you've ever heard of, and Quark has an immediate ready excuse for why Worf cannot have it. Not today. Fresh out. Never on a Tuesday. Sorry, the Cardassian voles just ate the last one. Sorry, that pattern's not in my replicator. It's very runny. More runny than I think you'd like. Oh, I'm sorry, it's gone off. And so on and so forth until finally, after this rapid-fire patter for about 2.5 minutes, as Worf gets angrier and angrier, he finally reaches over the counter, grabs Quark by the lapel and says, I want a bowl of gok. If I do not get gok, I will rip out your lungs. One bowl of gok coming up. Quark goes under the counter, comes up with the bowl, plants it in front of Worf. Worf digs in, picks up a handful of the little worms, looks at them and goes, this gok is dead. It's not dead. It's resting. Ah! Worf throws the bowl at Quark, who ducks. Worf storms out, and Quark goes, thought he'd never leave. And it was the audacity of ending the Cheese Shop sketch using the dead parrot sketch as the punchline to Cheese Shop sketch. I thought this would be an instant Star Trek classic moment.
Yes.
Fans will talk about this for as long as there are Star Trek fans, and alas, it never got made.
It is ex-Gok.
This is ex-Gok. It is pushing up the it has joined the choir. It has joined the Black Fleet Invisible.
Right. Well, you're very good at pitching stories. I think you aced your class in film school at that. And a lot of your ideas are so distinctive. And I'm sure that a lot of people who pitch stories have similar experiences. Now, I love Trek and I watch every episode, but a lot of times specific Trek episodes don't stand out in the way or with the distinctiveness of these pitches that you bring? Is it just natural for your ideas to kind of get the edges ground off as they get sort of fit into a weekly TV situation?
That is natural for television.
Yeah.
Television, because it is such a collaborative medium, it is the room, the individual voice, especially if you're a freelancer who's not part of the room. It's very hard to preserve anything of the original voice in the finished work.
Yeah.
Maybe the high concept, if you've got a really high concept episode, maybe that'll carry through if you're lucky. If you are able to be involved in the rewrites, you might have more of a say in how you interpret and apply the notes from the room.
Sure.
But the room, by its nature, is going to be a lot of people, a lot of very smart people, very talented people, all trying to find the best, most narratively satisfying solution. They may not always agree, and in the end, it's going to be the showrunner who makes the determination, that's the idea, that's what we're doing, write that.
Yeah.
And then, even after that draft is done, the showrunner is probably going to do a final pass over the script before it goes in front of cameras, which is why, that's how the shows maintain a consistent voice, the characters maintain a consistent tone. It is often the showrunner who enforces that final level of editorial quality control and just precision to say, this character should sound like this. This character is supposed to sound like this.
Right.
And so that happens. And again, the process of a debate when you've got anywhere from 6 to 8 or more people,
Right.
all very smart, very motivated in a room arguing over, well, here, I think we could do this. And someone says, well, I'm bumping against that because, if we do this, then doesn't that negate that? And if we do that, doesn't that make that whole point there irrelevant? And you go, oh, yeah, but, we could reconcile that. We could do this. Yeah, but then that's totally ridiculous. Why would we do that? All right, well, fine. We lampshade that. No big deal.
Right.
Right. Hang a lantern on it. We move on.
You've got a lot of creators now who are like sort of writer, producer, creator, sometimes directors, guys like Alan Ball and Sorkin and Matthew Weiner, whose vision is very specific and singular for a series. Of course, they have writers' rooms, but I'm sure they stay sort of at the forefront of what's going on to the screen. So I find with shows like that, I either like them a whole lot because I'm, in sync with their vision, or I don't really like those shows at all. But they're definitely less homogenized than regular TV.
Yeah, but I think that, those are sometimes the most interesting things.
Sure.
The ones where you can feel that unique quality of a creator's vision just coming through the screen, like what Brian Fuller brought to Pushing Daisies, for instance.
Yeah, sure.
That's a show that nobody else could have made. It was a distillation of many of the things that were important to him as a creator.
Yeah.
And if you respond to that, you love that show, and if you don't, you go, well, what a bunch of twee bullshit.
Yeah.
I happen to be in the category that loves Pushing Daisies. I thought it was a beautiful work of art, heartfelt, with great characters and a sort of a delightful whimsy. I can see why it might not work for other people. I'm in the camp that thinks it's a work of genius.
Yeah. Now I didn't like Pushing Daisies, but I did like Wonder Falls. So who knows?
There you go. Which I didn't care for.
Okay. Well, there you go.
These things happen.
Yeah. Right.
And that's why there are different channels and different shows on, because not every show works for everybody. And even if something doesn't work for me, I don't think that means it's a bad show. I go, oh, I'm the wrong audience for this.
Well, sure.
If other people dig this, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm glad somebody enjoys it. I don't have to be that person, but I also don't have to denigrate it.
Certainly.
I can just say, I'm not the right guy for that.
Yeah. Well, this is your 4th appearance on this show, meaning that you are now a lieutenant commander. Congratulations on that.
Wow.
I'm curious, what's the career path for the upper echelon of ships services officers? I mean, at this point, you should really be coordinating ship services on a star base or on a squadron level.
Well, ship services is a very specific division within Starfleet.
Okay.
Ship services are the people who, if you're having a VIP reception, they're the ones who set the officers' mess, and make sure the banquet is laid out. And ship services, things like quartermaster, berthing assignments, stuff like that. I never really would see myself as ship services. That's not really, an industry I'd want to be in. I'd prefer to be in command or engineering. I think of myself as a literary engineer.
Ah, okay. I see. So Geordi is what? He's lieutenant commander by the end of TNG, I think.
I think so, and we've got him up to a full commander in the books right now.
Sure, and I've heard some people. People are divided, at least from what I've heard. Like some people think that he's just born and bred like an engineer, and other people see his character as being that's a step to somewhere else. Like he does have his eye on command. He is, from a military family. He's good at engineering, but he doesn't see himself doing that forever.
Well, not everybody who goes into the military ends up on a command track, and you can spend many years working your way up. He's a chief engineer aboard a capital ship. That's a pretty significant officer post. It doesn't tend to lead to the command track very often, and nor should it. There are many engineering officers who are perfectly content to hit that level and say, that's the top of my field.
Yeah.
Now, what we have in the books at the moment, until we erase it, is that in addition to being the chief engineer, Geordi LaForge is also currently the second officer of the Enterprise.
Okay.
Worf is the acting executive officer, or actually not acting. He is the executive officer. Picard is still in command for the moment. So the current chain of command is Picard, Worf, LaForge. And then below LaForge, you would probably have the tactical chief, the chief of security, which would be Lieutenant Aneta Shmarova. So she'd probably be fourth in line of command. Okay. And so on, down through the ranks. There's a pretty clear hierarchy in any military organization. Mm-hmm. But, so he does have command responsibilities. If Picard is off the ship, as he is in Collateral Damage, for instance, Worf becomes the commanding officer. Geordi bumps right up to executive officer, which means he has to leave one of his deputy engineering chiefs in command of engineering, because once you're XO, you got to be on the bridge.
Yeah, right.
Now you're in the command information center. When he's second officer, when he's third in line of command and acting as chief engineer, well, then he's down in engineering, which is a great place to have your third in command, because if something happens to your command information center and you lose your captain and XO, well, your second officer / chief engineer takes over from the engineering deck.
Yeah, it worked for the old Enterprise.
Yeah, worked great for Scotty.
Yeah.
Scotty didn't always have to be on the bridge to take over.
Lieutenant Commander Mack, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISTPod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
They can find my website at davidmack.pro. That's David Mack, MACK.PRO. Or you can find me on Twitter at David Allen Mack. Allen is ALAN MACK.
And when can people expect to see Collateral Damage and the Shadow Commission?
Collateral Damage, my next Star Trek The Next Generation novel, which is going to be tying up storylines from the last 15 or so years of literary continuity, will be coming out on Tuesday, October 8th of this year. Early copies will be on sale at New York Comic Con. I will be at New York Comic Con probably all 4 days in the Simon & Schuster Pavilion, hawking and offering autographs and inscriptions on every sold copy of Collateral Damage. So if you're going to be in New York and at New York Comic Con this October, be sure to stop by the Simon & Schuster booth, as I plan to be there. And that's a great way to pick up the book early before it goes officially on sale.
Sure.
The Shadow Commission, the conclusion to my Dark Arts trilogy at Tor Books, comes out on June 9 of 2020. It got delayed. Originally, I thought it was going to be out earlier. I actually realized I needed to do a serious rewrite on it, and that ended up delaying it a few months. But it's going to be a much better book for it. So look for that in June of 2020.
We'll be looking for those, and good luck with those upcoming works. And thanks again for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And we're signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.